ship is not composed of one piece of metal, okay? It's actually three pieces, and they join it. They join it with a block of rubber that's about that thick, okay? And it goes all the way under the ship and around, goes to the other side. And what happens in rough seas, okay, is that expansion joint opens up and closes. So it's really, if you get near where it is on the ship, I mean, it's covered over, but you can lift it up and look at it. It's really funny to go for something to go from 6 inches to 12 inches. You know, it's kind of like scary a little bit, maybe. I sure hope the rubber doesn't break. You know, but it was kind of neat. You know, we got in when we were coming out of Japan. We got into a typhoon coming out of Japan after in Vietnam after we took a break. We went up to Japan and we got a typhoon coming out of Japan. Well, I have I used to have pictures. I don't have them anymore. But the whole nose of the destroyer buried itself in the ocean, and water is coming up, you know, over the deck, and then the destroyer will come back up. You know? Wow. But it was pretty awesome. I went up on where this picture is here. That's about the highest level you can get to on the ship, and be able to stand, you know, comfortably. Yeah. You can go higher, but you just can't stand up. So, or unless you're hanging onto the mast. So, you know, I could stand in front of the director and I could get up on top of there and I could see it, and you could just watch it, you know, bury itself and come back up. Jeez. It was really pretty awesome. There's some very beautiful things when you're at sea that you will never experience on land the same way. I've seen, I was doing, had the after watch, which is the watch at the rear end of the ship where you're a lookout at the end of the ship. And the sun was coming up on one side of the ship and the moon was setting on the horizon on the other. Wow. So you're seeing both of them come up, and you know, both of them, the one come up and the moon go down, and the moon go down. It was, well, you know, it's really pretty cool.
Sounds good.
You know, so a lot of that stuff was happening. You know, there's some beautiful things at sea. I've only seen the sea like calm once in all the time I was there. There was always waves, but we were coming back from Norway on the Atlantic, which is unusual because the Atlantic gets kind of a reputation as being a little more choppy, and it was like a sheet of glass. I mean, you're going across this thing and it's like the surface of this table. It was that smooth. There was no waves at all. You're just cutting through the water. It's pretty cool.
Was there ever a time that you were worried that your ship was ordered to attack somewhere that could have innocent citizens?
I wasn't worried about it because we actually did it. We were in Vietnam doing what's called gunfire, call for fire missions. You know, either a Marine or Army unit was on the shore in Vietnam fighting, and they were having a problem and they wanted to get naval gunfire to support them. Okay, so the destroyers were usually about a mile offshore, and you could shoot a bullet roughly 9 miles. Okay, you know, so if they were having a problem and you were close enough, then you would get a call for fire mission, and then basically you track wherever that location was, and you'd send out what are basically ranging shells to figure out, you know, are we hitting the target? And once the spotter says, yeah, you're right on, then you do what's called fire for effect. So we had 4 5-inch guns on the ship. The bullets, when I say 5-inch, it means 5-inch in diameter. Then the bullets weigh about 55 pounds, and they have a destruction radius of about 50 yards. So if you're in the middle of a football field, right? And if you're somewhere between the 25-yard lines, you're dead. Basically is what it boils down to. But we did a lot of gunfire support. We did a lot of gunfire support at night, you know, where you're shooting shells and or usually like a phosphorus cell. There are different types of bullets. You had what's called high capacity, you had high explosive, you had VT frag, or you had fragmentation. Fragmentation is usually it's an anti-personnel kind of bullet. You had Willie Pete, which is white phosphorus, and that was used mostly to mark an area, and then they would fire for effect after they had marked the area.
When did you find out that you were going home?
When did I, you mean from Vietnam or just in general? When we returned home, we pretty much knew how long we were going to stay anywhere. I mean, the cruises are pretty much defined as far as you're going to do a 6-month med cruise, you know. So you pretty much know when you're leaving and you know when you're going. But if you remember when I was talking about how undermanned a lot of the ships were, that was fine for people like me who were single and didn't have any worries. But a lot of the guys, the guys that had been in for some time, were married and had families. So they were like getting into port, and then 2 to 3 weeks later, they were going back out on another cruise. The turnover was such because they were undermanned. That there wasn't any real break. You didn't get to spend time with your family hardly before you were back on the boat going to another cruise and be gone for 6 months. So that caused a lot of family problems, with the guys the guys who were career Navy but also had a family.
This is a bit of a long one. Today, when soldiers come home from serving, they're greeted with lots of respect and gratitude. Was it different when you came home from a war that most citizens didn't support?
I think the biggest thing was the lack of recognition. I mean, I wasn't in an airport where, people, were screaming at me or something and running around with, multicolored clothing and flowers in their hair. But there were rumors of that going on, where people weren't exactly cheering for you. You were pretty much, I think that the indifference was more the case. They didn't really care. It's like, well, you're one of them. I do remember being in Norway, and this young lady came up to me in the, I forgot, I think it was in Bergen, and this young lady came up to me and she said, I'm collecting to throw the Yankee aggressors out of Vietnam. And I looked at her and I said, well, I'm sorry, I'm an aggressor. I didn't know what to say. And she was really cute too. It's like, geez.
So I knew that after you left San Diego, you went to Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
But once you came back from being on the water, how did you end up in Maryland?
Okay. When I was in the Navy, I had a girlfriend from San Diego, and we broke up. And I had made some friendships when I was in Maryland initially with a family who lived actually in Langley Park. And so I didn't want to go back to San Diego. I just didn't feel like I wanted to go there. So I wanted to strike out and try something new. So I decided to stay with them for a little bit, look for a job, find a job, and then I would find an apartment, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So that's fundamentally what I did. And then I actually, through the family that I stayed with, one of their relatives there was an opening at the National Labor Relations Board in downtown Washington, D.C. So I went to work there in June of 1971, as a GS-5 at the time, which would give me about $4,000 a year, which in 1971 was enough to kind of make it, but from there.
Do you think there were benefits in the long run to yourself from the war, from serving?
You know, my dad had an interesting statement about that. He was in the Army in World War II. And he said that, you know, I would not take $1 million to do this again, but I wouldn't give you a dime to avoid it. In other words, you go through it, and at the time, you know, you're kind of like just you're going with the flow. You know, whatever happens to happens. You know, in retrospect, I think that your association with a smaller group of men creates a kind of a real definite bonding and feeling of community. You know, it's kind of like being on a football team where you're playing with the team. You become a part of something, and it may not be it may not be the best part, but it's a part of a group, and I think you kind of like you miss that when you leave. You're all alone.
If you could go back, would you make the same choices that you did, or why would you not?
Well, if I had known at the time that I have some medical issues that actually exhibited themselves when I was in high school, and if I had had them diagnosed, I would never have had to serve. I would not have been allowed to serve. It was funny that that the way circumstances worked out. I don't know how much of a real active thinking choice I made. It was more like kind of like a sequence of events where I stopped doing well in school, lost my 2S rating, got drafted by the Army, then sort of go, well, so things, I think it was more event driven than decision making, where it was more of I wasn't passive in this process, but at the same time, it wasn't something that I said, oh, I'm going to join the Navy and see the world. I did join the Navy and see the world. Yeah.
That's it.